All right. Welcome, everyone, back to the Open Publishing Fest. My name is Dan Rudman. I am the Associate Director of Punctum Books and also one of the organizers of the Open Publishing Fest. I hope you all are having a really wonderful time. We're nearing, I guess, the end of our second week of the fest, and there's been so many wonderful software demos and presentations and discussions around open access. So, it's really been very heartwarming. But one of my favorite things thus far at the Open Publishing Fest has been our readings that we've been doing, to just feel that connection to one another and to have opportunity just to kind of slow down and give each other our attention. It's been really lovely. And so today, we are super lucky to be joined by Julieta Singh and Jonathan Alexander, two scholars and authors who have published with Punctum in the recent past. Let's begin. I think today we'll begin with Julieta Singh. Julieta Singh is currently an ACLS Burkhardt Fellow at Columbia University's Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality. Her monograph, No Archive Will Restore You, published by Punctum Books, was listed as a finalist for the 2019 Lambda Literary Award. And Julieta's new book, The Breaks, is forthcoming with Coffee House Press. Julieta, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for inviting me, Dan, and Jonathan. Thanks so much for jumping on board with me here. I want to start by giving a monumental shout out to all of you at Punctum, Eileen, Vincent, and Dan, for being so incredible to work with and such amazing spearheaders of both of our books, Jonathan and mine, and all of our work more broadly. And also to say a really big thank you to Jonathan, whose book was really such a beautiful text to read as I was waiting for my Punctum book to come into the world. And also Jonathan was just extremely encouraging in the build up to the nervous release of this book. So I'm super happy to be here with both of you. So I think I've been invited to read for like 10, 15 minutes, and I'm gonna jump around from the beginning of the book, beginning with the first pages of the book in a section called A Thief, a Desire. It was 2004 and unapologetically frigid in Minneapolis. The radio had pronounced it the coldest day of the year, though I had learned by then to trust nothing that came from news channels. The heat in my studio apartment was out again, and I was bundled indoors in woolly socks, long johns, and a bulky coat, watching my breath billowing out of my body in smoky plumes. My building had been robbed twice within the past week, though my apartment had been magically spared. This is not quite true, because the intruder had in fact come to my door and taken from my doormat my sole pair of sneakers. He had been at the threshold, not quite inside my home, but at its border, and he had taken something from that borderland, something that held value for us both. In this sense, it seemed to me that we were undeniably linked. Despite the fact that he had not entered my space, I could feel him palpably inside, not in the fearful sense of anticipating his return, but in the sense that some trace of him had been left behind, had made its way across the threshold and into that tiny frozen space that had become my makeshift American home. Anticipating that the thief would strike again, I searched the apartment, trying to evaluate what else of mine might be seen as valuable to him. Attempting to abate my fear, I decided the ethical move was not to defend against him, but to find a way to welcome him, to make his forced entry feel less violating. I put a Post-it note in the fridge affixed to a can of Red Bull that read, "Please feel free." The note was a strange welcome to my unwanted intruder, an offering of something that it would not hurt me to lose. In fact, the Red Bull was the remnant of some other visitor, someone I had already forgotten who had left behind an item I would never consume. I knew there was an ethical flaw at work in my act of strange hospitality, of offering something to my intruder that I myself did not want. I was deep in self-critique even before the sticky had stuck. I was young and cold and could feel my body aging. As a brown Canadian kid, I had imagined America as a two-headed monster. One head was a gleaming blonde-haired boy with a mouthful of exotic American candies, a big perverse smile chewing unrelentingly. The other head was cloaked in the clownish headgear of the Ku Klux Klan. I found both heads silly and terrifying. Both in different ways seemed to want to devour me. I came to the United States to study, urged by keen Canadian professors that a PhD in hand from an American university would make me golden upon return. I came with hesitancy, never once considering that I might not return, that moving south would over time transform me into an expatriate. When that frigid day in Minneapolis had come to pass, I had been living in America for months and no longer envisioned the nation as a monster. In fact, I had grown to love monsters, recognizing their social function as the abject edges of society. The creation of the monster, I had discerned, is a way of crafting an outside so that a collective can imagine itself as bounded, cohesive, and impenetrable. The monster is a being who will not or cannot fit normally, whose existence makes others uncomfortable and who therefore must be shunned and exiled. No, America was not a monster, though it was highly skilled at creating monstrous figures and exerting force against them. My intruder guest felt like a monster, like something lurking at the edges of what I had come to believe was properly mine, something that threatened to come inside, and in so doing to force me to reckon with my relation to it. Waiting to be robbed is like waiting for an imminent accident in which both you and your assailant are together in disaster. Your assailant in that single moment wields more control, and in response you become, in a sense, other to yourself. You cannot uphold the usual fantasy of being a self-governing body. You are palpably exposed. I responded to this crisis of being by doing what I always do in moments of critical uncertainty. I did what I had come to America to do. I studied. I constructed a makeshift nest on my ratty old orange sofa, aesthetically a cross between a bus seat and a church pew. The cushioning inside was endlessly disintegrating, leaving piles of dust beneath it that spread across the floor like a listless diaspora. But I loved the look of that sofa, and in any case, I had no funds to replace it. I was burrowing myself between blankets, flipping through the pages of a foundational work of post-colonial studies, Edward Said's Orientalism, when I came upon a passage written by the Italian neo-Marxist political theorist Antonio Gramsci. This is the quote by Gramsci. The starting point of critical elaboration is the consciousness of what one really is, and is knowing myself as a product of the historical processes to date, which have deposited in you an infinity of traces without leaving an inventory. And he goes on to say, therefore, it is imperative at the outset to compile such an inventory. An infinite history of traces without an inventory, an endless collection of oneself that is impossible to gather. I had no concrete idea of what it meant or what currency it had in my own life, but I knew how it felt. It felt as though the broken thing I was might be restored, and it felt like an embodied idea I would never stop desiring for myself and for the world. The heat kicked back on in the middle of the night. I could hear the strange clanking of the radiators fumbling back to life, but by then it was not the double threat of freezing and burglary that left me sleepless, but the opaque and desperately seductive idea of my own impossible archive. How am I doing for time, Dan? Yeah, I'll keep going. This is from the beginning of a section that's titled after the book, No Archive Will Restore You. We were scrambling toward the archive. We knew it was crucial, but I suspect that few of us knew what it meant or where it was or what to do with it. We were graduate students in a small cultural theory program plummeting deeper and deeper into debt, which is in a sense its own hellish kind of archive. We were hoping to be one of the rare exceptions that would be plucked into that almost mythical land of tenure track work. The job market had undeniably tanked, and a PhD had radically changed over time from being a gateway into stable academic employment to being a credential with almost no real-world currency. As the university became more and more corporatized and increasingly driven by exploited labor, it was also churning us out in droves, spitting us into a world of highly competitive and highly unstable employment. Most of us would become underpaid adjunct laborers without access to healthcare, facing our mid-30s without a clear sense of what it had all been for. We told ourselves there was nothing else we would rather do than to study, to be trained into cultural critique over the course of a decade. And it was mostly true. We were trying to stay in solidarity with each other as we competed for scarce fellowships and dwindling jobs, watching the cohorts ahead of us fail to live out the promise of it all, wondering in more and less public ways why we had started down this anxiety-riddled road in the first place. Why did we stay on with the odds so stacked against us? I don't blame the archive per se, but it undoubtedly held a kind of promise for each of us that kept us tethered to academia. The archive was an elusive hope of our individual salvation. If we could find the right archive, the right stash of materials that was sexy enough to sell ourselves, we could be spared the depression, the anxiety attacks, the pre-midlife crises that would come when, one by one, we realized we were not going to be chosen. When in the face of that brutal rejection, we had no idea what the fuck to do with ourselves. If only we could stumble upon the right archive, the secrets that no one else had yet discovered, we might still be one of the chosen ones. The archive was an opaque hope, yet it kept slipping away as though it didn't want to be found, plundered, excavated. It became outright seductive in its evasiveness, and it kept making clear that it didn't want our masturbatory desire for it. The archive was pure tease, and we were unabashedly shoving borrowed dollar bills down its skimpy thong. If you're like me and you didn't roll into graduate school knowing the highfalutin importance of the archive, you learn it the moment you step into the seminar room. There, everyone is required to pretend to have one, and everyone wants to know yours. What's your archive? You'll be asked repeatedly, and your answer will reveal how seriously you should be taken. You learn quickly that archive in this context can mean almost anything. In its most obvious iteration, the archive might be a physical place where a collection of documents is housed. It behooves me here to admit that I have almost no experience of the brick and mortar archive, that in fact I have a long history of becoming discomfortingly overwhelmed in spaces that contain masses of information. Since childhood, I have felt like a shrunken mind that knows too little, that cowers like a beaten dog each time I am confronted by vast architectures of knowledge. But archive has more expansive meanings too, which can signal a body of literature, or a series of monuments, or a collection of images. In other words, archive in graduate school simply means what you are studying, and calling you what you study an archive gives it heft, grants it the status of an intellectual pursuit. Your archive is an expected declaration, a pronouncement that makes manifest your worth and belonging in the great halls of higher learning. The archive, it must be noted, is also your enabling fiction. It is the thing you say you were doing, well before you are actually doing it, and well before you understand what the stakes are of gathering and interpreting it. Should I do a tiny bit more? Okay, I'll do a tiny bit more. C had just returned from a year of research in Argentina when I met her in my first year of graduate school. She had a no-nonsense sensibility and a rare brisk walking pace that perfectly matched my own. She was several years ahead of me in her PhD, writing about Argentine women who, as political prisoners during the last dictatorship, stored subversive literature in their vaginal canals. She called this the Vaginal Library. Both metaphor and place, the Vaginal Library seemed to me an embodied archive in organic ruin. It brought the notion of preservation into the cell in a doubled sense, into those cages that imprisoned women and into the cellular structures of their bodies. Truth be told, I have never once since then heard the word archive without thinking immediately of dissenting vaginas. These two things, archive and vagina, have become sutured in my thought. I learned from C about these dissenting Argentine women just after the building burglaries. after I had stumbled on Gramsci's summon to compile an inventory of historical traces. It was then that I started to wonder over my own body as an impossible, deteriorating archive, a body that had, across my life, felt both excessive and insufficient, oftentimes even monstrous. Abandoning the pursuit of a legitimate archive, one external to me and one that might ensure my professional success and upward mobility, I began instead to dwell on the messy, embodied, illegitimate archive that I am. And one last little paragraph. My best childhood friend, P, a rogue archivist of her own history, retains everything she cherishes. There are entirely conventional aspects of her archive comprised of old answering machine messages, photographs, love notes. But there are more perverse items too, such as the single crinkly pubic hair culled from the body of the boy with whom she lost her virginity. It has moved with her across 2.5 decades of her life. It travels with her. We might even say that it has, in a sense, become her. At the very least, it is a material sign of a moment in which she knew with absolute certainty that her body was being opened and exposed to an outside world. I'll stop with the crinkly pubic hair.
Thank you so much, Julieta.
Thank you.
All right. Up next is Jonathan Alexander. Jonathan Alexander is Chancellor's Professor of English at the University of California, Irvine. He is the author, co-author, or co-editor of 16 books. His critical memoir, Creep, was a finalist for Lambda Literary Award in 2018. Thanks so much for being here, Jonathan.
Great, thank you, Dan, and thank you, Julieta. What a wonderful book. I've been a fan of the book ever since I got a copy of it, and I regularly pass out portions of No Archive Will Restore You to students and say, you know, if you're at all interested in what queer memoir can do, this is something you need to be paying attention to. So thank you for that reading. And thanks, of course, to Punctum Press and to Eileen and to Dan and to Vincent and all of those who are making the press a real powerhouse for open access and innovative publishing in the academic world. I want to read a little bit from the introduction to Creep, which is a book that I wrote when I was trying to grapple with my own sense of the power of telling queer stories. What is the worth of telling them if we can't really be honest with each other about some of our own foibles, some of our own hesitancies, some of our more shameful, less proud moments. And I wanted to try to see if I could push myself, not only to be honest, but to see if I could use some of the granularity of a queer life as a mode of critique. And so what's been so fun is to think about how the damages of something like homophobia can become transformed in some curious ways. And that's what I hope Creep is about, how my own upbringing in the Deep South in the late 60s and 70s might have left its damaged traces, my own sense of my creepiness, but how that also can be made not just manifest, but manifoldly interesting and perhaps even critically useful. So I'll let you be the judge. So I'm sitting in a hipster coffee shop, coffee lab, not far from my home in Irvine, California. Like most days, the sun is peeking over the mountains through some morning ocean fog, and the traffic has already started to accumulate. For over a year now, I've gotten up early to head with my laptop and fetch an overpriced cup of coffee, offering myself the best hours of the day for writing. This coffee shop is one of the ones I frequent. Coffee's actually very good, and the baristas, all young folk with their careful haircuts and corded pants, just a touch of blocky plaid creating contrast with the sculpted curves of facial hair. Well, they've gotten to know me. Somewhat. At first, they seemed hesitant. I'm not the usual clientele. I'm nearly 50, and while I can dress well, I have often shown up here in my sweatpants and a t-shirt, baseball cap not quite keeping the stray curls of my long forehead hair in check. I must look unkempt at best on those days. But the coffee jockeys have been accustomed to me, and some familiarity has lessened their intuitive contempt. I take my $4 cup of coffee, something called alchemistic, which is some mornings stunningly good. The hot water sifted in some magical way through the specialty coffee in a fancy machine made by a company called Alpha Dimension that only makes these machines for upscale coffee shops. I take this cup of coffee and head around the corner of the coffee bar to write. It's just a little after 7 a.m., and the place will slowly fill up within the hour. No one will talk to me. Probably a combination of my sitting here typing on this machine, but also my obvious misplacement. Which one of these is not like the other? The lesson is well ingrained. A young guy, immaculately coiffed, with what I call precision hair, can flirt with the baristas, male or female, and keep coming back day after day, a welcome sight. He's a good-looking dude, and another regular like me, someone I sometimes see pulling up to the shop in his sporty little blue Mini Cooper. I have neither his youth nor good looks, a winning combination. But I've come to know my place as I sit here typing away. I do try at times to be friendly, to approach the generational barrier, to peek at what's on the other side. It's not easy, though. I once asked to see a young woman's hand tattoo as she set a cup of coffee down in front of me, and she looked at me as though I'd slapped her. She showed me, but it was weird. I try to remember that this is the generation of trigger warnings, and it's often a hair trigger easily set off. My showing up here isn't part of their curated world. I'm the oddball out, as we used to say. Indeed, though, odd doesn't capture it. I begin to worry that my presence here is creepy. These kids want to serve one another, be seen with one another, not be on display for me. I'm intruding, and in forcing them to accommodate themselves to me, I'm acting a bit strange, and I know it. But maybe I'm overstating the case. Maybe I'm just feeling my years as never before. After all, I'm easily double the age of most people here, sitting with my laptop, pounding away at the keyboard, letting loose an unexpected chortle as I write my way into some insight that is probably only fascinating to me. They might think I'm autistic, or worse, lonely. But I return, perhaps masochistically, to buy the expensive coffee in this place, in which I don't quite fit in. I take out my phone to check text messages. Often the usual, various friends pinging me, one in particular from Ohio, a former colleague and dearly loved soul, who just a few years older than I has been diagnosed with MS. We enjoy quick, regular chats, often daily, continuing to be a part of each other's lives, if only for moments at a time. She can't walk anymore, can't work, can barely read, so little messages from 2,000 miles away help keep her at least somewhat connected to the world. And frankly, they do the same for me. She's been such a part of my life the last 20 years. Then I look through my photos. I'm always taking shots of things that interest me. One of the baristas, what I'm a little bit attracted to, comes around and bends down right in front of me, scouting out something beneath the counter. I hear the fumbling as I watch his ass bob up and down with the search. It's so quick I barely notice that I'm snapping a pic of his behind. And again. The phone doesn't make a sound. He finds what he's looking for and walks away, but not before looking over his shoulder to ask me if the alchemistic is okay. Oh, yes, it is, thank you. And I realize, oh, fuck, I'm a total fucking creep. I don't delete the picture. I'm sorry if I laugh. I have to admit, that's one of my favorite parts of the book to read. Hard to know what else to read after that. I've been browsing around and probably at my time, huh, Dan? No. Let's see. What I might do is just go back to the very end of the introduction and read just a little bit of it, because I do try to take a couple of more serious turns in the book where I'm thinking about the ways in which many of us have been invited to think about ourselves as creepy, as creeps. And how part of one's subjectivity in that case is battling that. The unnaturalness, even the specter of the creepy, is for many not just threatening, but exciting. Exciting, perhaps, in the possibility of threat. Yes, we get creeped out, but we are also fascinated by creeps, perhaps in part because we all sense the possibility inside ourselves for creepy behavior. Marketers know this phenomenon, and some have used it, as in a strange but striking advertisement for Diesel shoes, in which an old man creeps down to lick a younger man's footwear. A commentator at the Propaganda for Change blog, which takes a critical look at a variety of persuasive media, readily identifies the old man as creepy. But so too, I'd argue, is the young man, using his left foot to push down the older man's neck. And maybe so are we for looking at this ad and potentially finding it somewhat intriguing. Yes, I want my tennis shoes to dominate others, the ad seems to call out to you. Or at the very least, the advertiser suggests that wearing these shoes might empower you, even in a vaguely sexualized way. Surely, sex has been used to sell for a long time. But what about creepy sex? Apparently, some marketers are willing to bank on its selling too. So creepiness surrounds us in marketing and throughout social media, and the subtle sense of threat lurking in encounters with strangers, encounters most of us probably have on a daily basis. This is obviously pre-pandemic. More personally, creepiness for me seems not just a lurking potential, but also a pressing matter of identity. In large part because I grew up thinking I was creepy, probably like many gay men of my generation growing up in the Deep South with little access to gay subculture. We were told again and again that the feelings we had for other boys were wrong, dangerous, damning, and even deadly. And indeed, for much of the 20th century, homosexuality and creepiness went hand in hand. Bedfellows in the popular imagination that saw queer sexuality as a threat to normalcy, even an attack on the American way of life. In the 1950s, public service announcements such as "Boys Beware" featured clearly creepy men offering rides to unsuspecting boys charmed by the offer of gifts and friendship. What's perhaps even creepier about such videos is the way in which the warnings also targeted the young men too, suggesting that they needed to be on guard, not just against the creeps' advances, but because they too could be turned into creeps. They might be bent toward queerness. The creeper's never just a danger from outside. Creepiness always lurks within as well. I grew up with such fears, worrying over my sexuality, wondering when others would discover my creepiness. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Well, that was Julieta Singh and Jonathan Alexander reading from their Punctum books. From Julieta Singh, No Archive Will Restore You, and from Jonathan Alexander, Creep. Both of those books are available in print and in digital open access. That is one of the founding tenets of Punctum books. All of our publications are available to read and for the public with no request for data or money. Thank you all so much again for being a part of this and for taking the time to read your books. It's just such a lovely way to experience your books and to be reminded as to why they're so special. I really appreciate y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah. All right. Thank you all so much for joining us at the Open Publishing Fest, and we will see you soon.